Hello, and welcome to this special interview in anticipation of the launch of Asia Society Australia's Disruptive Asia publication, Volume 4, Sustainability in the Asian Century. My name is Sophia Hamblin Wang, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Mineral Carbonation International. And I'm also an author and contributor to this year's Disruptive Asia publication. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on the lands which I'm coming to you from today. And I'd like to acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people watching this video today. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, former Prime Minister of Australia and President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, the Honourable Kevin Rudd AC. Mr. Rudd has a long history of advocating for sustainability and climate action. In 2007, Kevin Rudd called climate change the greatest economic, environmental, and moral challenge of our generation, a statement that sadly remains true 13 years later. While 2020 has been an incredibly challenging year for the world, it has also been time of growing global momentum and around climate change, with mid-century net zero emissions targets being set by China, Japan, and South Korea in recent weeks alone. Disruptive Asia, Asia Society Australia's leading publication, has this year been dedicated to a discussion of key questions relating to global sustainability, with a focus on how the recent rise of Asia in impacting sustainable development and the 2030 Agenda. Many experts and commentators have shared their views and perspectives, and it's very fitting to turn to Kevin Rudd today, who has been so influential on these issues, both here in Australia and in our region. Hi, Kevin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Sophia, and glad to be talking about climate change, climate action, and sustainability in Asia. Over to you.
You're speaking to a fellow Queenslander and ANU alum, so it's extra special to speak to you.
Oh, we carry two sets of common scar tissue, but apart from that.
That's right. So, first question. Speaking at the third annual Pacific Cities Sustainability Initiative Forum in Beijing in 2015, you said, if the problem of climate change cannot be solved in Beijing, if it cannot be solved in Washington, let me tell you, it won't be solved anywhere else. Well, now we're seeing both Washington and Beijing taking strong action on climate change. Can you unpack what that now could mean for the global fight against climate change? Are the Paris Agreement goals now within our reach?
I believe they are, and there are reasons for that, which goes to the simple mathematics. China, at Xi Jinping's address to the UN General Assembly in September, for the first time committed the country to achieving net carbon neutrality by 2060. By 2060. Look at the fine print they leave open doing it earlier, around about mid-century. Secondly, Japan, prior to the US presidential election outcome under new Prime Minister Suga, as the world's third largest economy, committed Japan to achieving net carbon neutrality by 2050. And of course, with the election of the Biden administration, Biden has already made plain in his campaign that will be his administration's commitment as well. Add to that the Europeans, who have a long-standing commitment to net carbon neutrality by 2050, 70% plus of the global economy now has this as a mid-century target. And where the mathematics gets really interesting and encouraging is that this then has to drill back into what each of these economies, including Australia, does in the critical trajectory between 2020 and 2030, taking us through to the end of the Paris commitment period. And so each country's nationally determined commitment, or NDC, will have to be A, mindful of the 2050 neutrality target, and therefore what are the logical stepping stones through to 2030 to credibly get there. That's why I think for the first time we are within the delta of achieving this outcome, aided and supported by the innovations in renewable technology and the coming down of costs and prices in that sector.
Excellent. Staying on the subject of the US and China, do you think climate action could be a major area of cooperation between these two otherwise at odds global powers? Will it be a force for good in an increasingly fractured world?
Well, it's important to look at the evolution of China's position on climate change first. I first rubbed shoulders with the Chinese on climate change memorably in Copenhagen in 2009, where we had somewhat clashing views. And there's a reason for that. We Australians at that stage were global champions of early climate change action. And for China, they had not reached domestic political and policy consensus on it until around about 2010, 2011. And so what began as Chinese hostility to orchestrated global action in 2009, by the time you get to Paris in 2015, had changed 180 degrees. So that's why the Chinese have joined forces on this, because they're driven ultimately by where the science takes them nationally. And they realize that as a country which dreams of becoming the world's largest economy by about 2030, that they want to occupy this new global status with a sustainable environment and economy domestically, as opposed to one subject to increasing desertification, extreme weather events, drought, flood, and the rest. As for the Americans, they represent the second largest slab of global greenhouse gas emissions. You put the two of them together, and suddenly the tango, the GHG tango, starts to look like an impressive dance. In fact, between them, they would command close to 50% of global emissions. So if these two work together, not only is it good for the planet, not only is it good for their countries domestically, because both of them are highly vulnerable to climate change effects now, like Australia, but it will also add an element of positivity to the overall negative chemistry to the US-China relationship strategically at this time. And we in the Asia Society have been facilitating those dialogues between the Americans and the Chinese in the year leading up to the Biden presidential election in anticipation of that possibility.
So picking up what you just said and turning to Australia, with many of our regional neighbours pledging new mid-century climate targets, will Australia be forced into gear with regard to taking more radical measures to slow climate change? What needs to be done to step up our national response to climate change, particularly after the year we've had domestically with all of our bushfires?
Well, Australia as the driest continent on Earth should be leading the global action, not following it. That's why I did what I did back in 07, 8, 9, and 10. Because we feel the impacts first, whether it's the Great Barrier Reef in the north, through coral bleaching, whether it's what happens with intense drought and bushfire in southeastern and southwestern Australia. These things were known predictions by the CSIRO in Australia more than a decade ago. As Prime Minister of Australia then, I regarded myself as having a national fiduciary duty to act early and as decisively as possible in these questions, hence our actions on renewable energy target, hence our actions on climate, on the carbon pricing. So here we are, 13 years later, and 7 years into the current Conservative government, which has been strongly influenced by, let's call it climate change denialism, led out of the Murdoch media in particular, but also it has its own residual home in various elements of the coalition. Right now, the global focus will be on Australia, for the simple reason is America has now shifted. Trump is now gone. Australia cannot, as it were, hide under the armpit of the climate change denier-in-chief, Donald J. Trump, in the White House, because the razor-sharp focus of global opinion out of Europe, out of Beijing, out of Tokyo, out of Seoul, and out of Washington is now on Canberra. So what's my prediction? Mr. Morrison has already begun a subtle crab walk by abandoning his position on the utility of so-called Kyoto credits to account for Australia's overall climate change greenhouse gas mitigation effort. The next part of the crab walk, I predict, will be to adopt a mid-century carbon neutrality target. But what I would say is that when Mr. Morrison does that, the critical question will be this: what do we do in the decade ahead, 2020, 2030, for the remainder of the Paris commitment period? Because he can commit to carbon neutrality mid-century and basically just walk away from it. Or you can deliver a credible trajectory over the next decade, because there's only 3 decades to go to mid-century. And unless you've got a curve going like that in the 2020s, by the time you get to 2030, 2040, 2050, you can't just suddenly do that. it's got to be a curve which takes you in that direction in terms of greenhouse gas reduction and renewable energy increase. So therefore, my challenge to Mr. Morrison is not just to get with the strength on a mid-century target of carbon neutrality, it's to produce a radically new, ambitious, nationally determined commitment under the Paris Agreement for Australia for the period 2020 to 2030, and in particular out to the year 2025.
You're absolutely right. This is the critical decade of action. So drawing on some of my own work and particular interests as I work in decarbonisation technology, the inevitable change to the energy mix in Asia is a big opportunity, I would say, for Australia, both politically, but also in making new investments and entering new markets. RCEP, the world's largest trade agreement, which Australia signed on to earlier this month, though, does not mention climate change. What does that say about climate change as a priority in Asia? Where does climate change stand as an issue with our key partners in the region?
In Northeast Asia, we see considerable action in Japan, Korea, and the People's Republic of China, all of which are moving towards or have adopted emissions trading schemes of one form or another with a carbon price. And we, again, at the Asia Society Policy Institute, for the last 3 to 4 years, have worked with carbon price regulators in Beijing, Seoul, and Tokyo on technical aspects of the work they are doing, with the objective of linking these 3 carbon markets eventually across Northeast Asia. So we've been, as it were, at the forefront of this work at a technical and policy level. Southeast Asia, the work is much less advanced, and that is a challenge for all of us. And one of the reasons why Australia needs to act is to then join forces with our friends in Southeast Asia, in particular the next largest economy, Indonesia, to move towards a carbon price. Thirdly, the big gaping hole is India in South Asia. And India and South Asia, action so far has been minimal. And so across Pan-Asia, the map is therefore quite different. Northeast Asia leading, the other 2 sub-regions, as it were, lagging. And Australia, regrettably, is an advanced economy, lagging probably most of all.
Now to climate finance. 2020 was meant to be a key milestone in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change. This is particularly true for climate finance and for the agreement between higher and lower income countries that if governments took steps to limit carbon emissions, they would be supported with technical and financial assistance. Due to a lag in reporting, it will take another 2 years to know for sure whether high-income countries have met their commitment to provide 100 billion of climate finance to lower-income countries per year by the year 2020. Even if they officially reach the $100 billion mark, there will continue to be questions about whether that funding truly reflects the spirit of a global climate change agreement built on trust and solidarity. What's your assessment here? Is climate finance diverting from development assistance?
Well, there is both bad news and good news in this overall climate finance story. The bad news is, back in Copenhagen in 2009, when I was part of the drafting group for what became the Copenhagen Accord, which was then gavelled into international legal reality the following year in Cancun and formed the basis of what was then done in Paris 5 years later. It included new agreements on 1.5 degrees centigrade as the global ceiling for temperature increases this century. It agreed also for the first time on developed and developing country action, not just developed country action. And thirdly, it agreed on a global system of measurement, reporting and verification so that we could know what was actually happening out there and that no individual countries were cheating. And finally, I remember the drafting of this acutely, the Global Green Fund. The Global Climate Fund. And in that room in Copenhagen, sitting down there with the drafters on 30 billion, 100 billion, and ranges in between. And the whole objective of this fund was for low-income countries to be able to draw on this fund for climate change adaptation purposes, not just mitigation purposes. And that is for the most climate-exposed countries in the world. For example, Bangladesh, the island states of the South Pacific, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and others, the Marshall Islands, as well as countries in the Indian Ocean and some in the Caribbean, which are enormously climate vulnerable, to enable them to have this fund to draw upon. Like you, I have skepticism of the extent to which countries have stepped up to this task. I too have not seen the data, but given that everyone's development assistance budgets has been under duress, and given that countries like Australia in the last 7 years have effectively halved their development assistance budget overall, I'm sceptical of the extent to which this fund has been properly provided for. I said there was good news as well, and that's what's happening in private capital markets. Because the price signals have now gone out and the regulatory signals have now gone out reasonably loud and clear across Europe, increasingly now in Northeast Asia, and now prospectively in the United States, reinforced with shareholder action and corporate social responsibility, that you begin to see shifting behavior by private capital markets radically away from new investments in carbon and radically towards new investments in renewables. That's what's encouraging. Back in 2009, this was a mere blip on the horizon. Now it's quite a large hump on the horizon. This is good. So that's the good news. The Global Green Climate Fund is the bad news.
To conclude the discussion, let's take a look ahead. Next year, we have COP26 after this year's summit got postponed. And we hope to see a positive trajectory as Asian economies come out of a recovery and economic stimulus phase to one focused on future growth and renewed ambitions. Where does that leave the SDGs in your view? What's the outlook for a low carbon future in Asia? And who needs to take the leadership as we progress into the so-called decade of action?
The world still looks to America for leadership. That's the truth of it. But if on the question of global climate action, we could see the phenomenon of a tripartite leadership between the three largest economic entities in the world, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Europeans, and the top four, if you include Japan, this is a pretty interesting leadership quartet. So if it's a string quartet, I'm not sure who's playing the bass, the cello, the viola, and the violin. But so long as someone's conducting, it should be able to play some reasonable music because it represents collectively such a huge slice of global emissions. I'm relatively optimistic that these four entities, given their new mid-century targets, can now begin turbocharging their work. It's a further reason for my confidence in American leadership. I believe the Biden administration will reconvene something like the Major Economies Forum to drive climate change action by the G20 economies. I also believe it will find its way back to the G20 agenda. I also believe you're going to see it more prominently on the APEC agenda now that you've got both Japan and China on board. Finally, across our own region, the leadership, I believe, is likely at this stage to come out of Japan, China, and Korea in Northeast Asia. The tragedy is that should be Australia. And again, to conclude this conversation where it almost began, given our national circumstances, given the fires of the last summer, and for those of us in Queensland like you and me who cherish our Great Barrier Reef, for God's sake, let's stop fiddling while Rome literally burns. Let's stop being a global climate change pariah in terms of continued inaction, not just inaction nationally, but sometimes sabotage internationally of global consensus, and rise to the occasion at COP26 in Glasgow. Even Boris Johnson, one of the world's leading conservatives, gets climate change in a way in which the Australian conservatives do not. So we're going to need a combination of Johnson in Britain, the Europeans out of Brussels, the Japanese out of Tokyo, the Chinese out of Beijing, and President Biden shoehorning the Australian government into doing what it should have been doing for the last 7 years. I hope that happens, but it's critical we all add our voice to it because this is not a partisan question. In no other countries other than the United States and Australia is this any longer a partisan question. Why is it a partisan question here? Well, maybe that explains what I'm doing in a different forum on a different news organisation, which somehow colours the debate on climate change denial. but that's a subject for a different occasion.
These are profoundly important topics to discuss. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Kevin Rudd. Really, thank you.
It's good to be with you, Sophia, and all the best to our friends at the Asia Society.